Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we are headed to the west coast of the U.S., to the Pacific Northwest, to chat with the author of Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific, Ira Wesley Kitmacher. Despite its idyllic setting, the coast of the Pacific Northwest has another darker name by which it's known, the Graveyard of the Pacific. 2,000 ships and countless lives have been lost to the waters of the Pacific Ocean, and the Columbia River has claimed many more. The spirits of early settlers, Native Americans, and drowned mariners are said to linger near the shores. From ghostly treasure hunters eternally searching for buried gold to a graveyard filled with souls that met violent ends, legends abound. Join author Ira Wesley Kitmacher as he uncovers mysterious tales and takes readers on a road trip through the most haunted place in America. Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific is available on Amazon Kindle or at arcadiapublishing.com. Hey, Ira, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be with you.
So I threw in the intro there, I threw the synopsis of the book in there, just to get a little more information to people that might not be familiar. Like we were talking about before we started recording here, it's the Pacific Northwest is not really included a whole lot in a lot of the ghost shows and stuff. It's more kind of the Bigfoot shows that kind of highlight that area.
Yeah, that's, and I should say, and as I was just mentioning to you, I grew up in New England and in Massachusetts, where there's a rich folklore tradition and haunted history, especially around Salem and the witch trials and ghost stories in general. And I've lived elsewhere in the country. I mentioned that I lived in Northern Virginia and made many trips to the Gettysburg Battlefield and Williamsburg, and just this past fall I went to Sleepy Hollow, New York. And anyway, whenever I have a chance to travel, and I have lived in many different places, I always take the opportunity to sort of explore the folklore and the history, and especially the haunted folklore of the different regions. And at some point, I should say that my background is a little bit eclectic, and it may not seem to naturally lead to writing these types of books. Yeah. I actually, I'll just briefly mention, I served as a senior executive with the federal government in Washington, D.C. I also have been a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. and other universities. I'm an attorney, but underlying all those things, I've always had a very deep interest in history, and especially sort of the haunted folklore. And at some point in my career, I was previously out here on the West Coast, living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I had the opportunity to travel throughout the region and became acquainted with this particular area where I live now, which is surrounded, if people are familiar with the Astoria, Oregon part of Oregon and Washington State.
Yeah.
Astoria, Oregon is actually the oldest American settlement west of the Mississippi River, and there's a lot of history. And what I found was there are just numerous, I would say hundreds, tales of hauntings and haunted folklore, and I have found it fascinating. And I've used some of the skills I developed as a senior executive and as an attorney and as a professor in doing research and organizing information and really delving into some of these folkloric traditions of the area.
Yeah, and listeners might know the Astoria area as the setting for the movie The Goonies.
Right.
That's kind of where that movie was filmed, most of it, and kind of the backdrop for that movie. But yeah, I'm always surprised that because there's, everywhere is haunted. I mean, because we have, we don't have a history like Europe, does like thousands of years, but we got a couple hundred years, and, out that way past the Mississippi, like you're saying, that's the oldest settlement. It's, all that was all settled like in the early 1800s, late 1700s, kind of with Lewis and Clark going out there and exploring. And so, yeah, there's a vast history and rich history as well, especially with the ocean being there and fishing and that whole industry. And you kind of start off the book with the Seafaring Superstitions, which I think is where a lot of the legends and probably maybe some of the hauntings come from.
You're right. This area is a very nautical themed area, and where I live, I'm probably 20 minutes from what is called the mouth of the Columbia River. For those folks who are not familiar so much with the Columbia River, it's the second largest river in America after the Mississippi River. And it goes all the way from the Rocky Mountains and then goes through Idaho and Washington and Oregon and Washington State, and empties into and meets with the Pacific Ocean at Astoria, Oregon. And that's where the term graveyard of the Pacific came about, because since the late 1700s, and primarily through the early 20th century, but it's still happening, there's still been shipwrecks just as recently as a few weeks ago out here. There have been over 2,000 ships that have wrecked, primarily around the mouth of the Columbia River where it meets the Pacific Ocean. But also, if you look up the definition of graveyard of the Pacific, it ranges from northern Oregon up through Astoria, Oregon, up the Washington coast, all the way up to Vancouver Island in Canada, and sort of ends in Seattle. And again, over 2,000 shipwrecks, countless lives have been lost, and just an uncounted number of sort of ghostly tales and haunted tales that derive from all those facts I just laid out. But there's other parts of the history too. Some folks think that graveyard of the Pacific just refers to the water and to the shipwrecks. And as I have found in my research, and I've done lots of research over the last several years, there's just numerous stories inland as well and along the coastal areas. Everything from Native Americans whose lands were stolen by people who were coming in to settle the area, to the Oregon Trail, which was the main east-west route for folks coming from the east back in the mid and late 1800s out to the Pacific Northwest and west. Just many, many stories. Portland, Oregon, in 2020 was ranked the number 5 or the 5th most haunted city in America by Travel and Leisure magazine, and it routinely is up there as far as hauntings, as well as Seattle. And I could go on, and I'd be happy to go on, but there's just many, many stories.
Yeah, and talking about Portland, you have the famous Shanghai tunnels.
Right.
There's just a huge history, and that's kind of where you get the term. They get the term, Shanghaiing somebody by, and for anybody that doesn't know, it comes. They think it comes from where they would get people drunk or put on drugs, and they would take them down the tunnels and kidnap them, and then ship them off as kind of I guess slave labor.
Right. And this was a very frequent activity. I'll take a step back again and say I'm originally from New England, and I don't recall there being sort of tunnels underneath cities like Boston and New York and Washington, D.C. Maybe they do exist. I don't know of them. But when you get out to the West Coast, especially Portland, Oregon, Astoria, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, one of my favorite activities is to take haunted tours. There are many haunted tours of these underground areas. And the reason why there are so many of these underground tunnels is that many of these cities, if you look at the history, have burned down several times. For instance, Astoria, Oregon, where I'm close to living there, burned down twice in the late 1800s. And each time they rebuilt, and of course they were wooden structures at first, each time they rebuilt, they pulled away a little bit from the water, whether it be the Columbia River or the Pacific Ocean, trying to get away from the water, and they would build up higher. And so now you have these underground tunnels, as you said, in Portland, Oregon, and these other cities. And those tunnels were used in the late 1800s into the early 20th century for, as you just said, Eric, Shanghaiing, kidnapping, primarily sailors. And there's been accounts of thousands of sailors who were kidnapped, and as you said, either drugged or struck over the head or served bad liquor, whether it be in saloons or hotel lobbies or wherever it might be. And the next thing, and there are countless stories of them waking up, the next thing they know, they're on a ship headed for primarily the Orient, Asia, and in many cases Shanghai. So people think that that's one of the reasons why these tunnels were given the name Shanghai tunnels, or being Shanghaied. Another reason why the name is used is because many of these areas, like in Portland, Oregon, where these things occurred, was under what was then called Chinatown. And again, that related to the being Shanghaied. One of the early, and it was called crimpers. A crimper back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is one of these people who Shanghaied not only sailors for ships, but they also kidnapped women to serve as prostitutes and others. And so and crimp, it's thought to either come from a British word, which is what the British Navy would do to the American Revolutionary War soldiers. They would kidnap them and use them on board their ships. It also could refer to a Dutch term. Crimp refers to an aquarium where fish are kept captive. So one of the primary crimpers, his name was Bunko Kelly, and I covered this in the book. And he was both in Portland, Oregon, and then later in Astoria, Oregon, is credited for kidnapping thousands of sailors and women to serve as prostitutes. And one of the more colorful stories is he was walking by. He would get an order from a ship's captain who needed a crew, and so he would go out looking for sailors to basically drug and take and crimp for Shanghai. He was walking by a funeral home in Portland, and he heard what he thought were dozens of drunken men sort of singing and making moaning noises. And he stopped there, and he went in, and he saw what turned out to be 22 men who appeared to be drunk. He got some of his assistants to come with wheelbarrows and other devices, and they took these 22 men and took them down to a ship. Unfortunately for Bunko Kelly, they weren't drunk on alcohol. They'd been drinking embalming fluid, and embalming fluid is deadly.
Wow.
And so by the time the ship's captain went to look into his hold on the ship to look for these 22 sailors, they were all dead. And so Bunko Kelly, of course, went out and found additional sailors for him. But that's one of the more colorful stories that came out of these days of being shanghaied and crimping. And there are many stories, like I mentioned, there's haunted tours of many of these tunnels. They're very creepy locations. And there are many stories of unseen hands and the sounds of unseen footsteps from unseen entities, and pushing and choking and sort of the cold spots and all the kinds of things that you many times will hear with these haunted stories. But many of them have been reported in these tunnels, and it's thought to be from these sailors who were shanghaied and these women who were kidnapped and others.
Yeah, the tunnels, the history is amazing, because they also, if I remember my history correctly, they also had like brothels and stuff down in those tunnels.
Right, you're right. They had brothels, they had opium dens, they had other illicit activities, and in many cases, like with Seattle, when Seattle burned down and they rebuilt 14 feet higher, and it's fascinating. I don't know if you're familiar with the early 1970s television series Night Stalker, Night Strangler.
Yeah.
The fascinating TV series. One of those episodes was called The Night Strangler, and it was set in the supposed undergrounds of Seattle. And I won't go into the details of the story, but I just, within the last few months, went on another tour of the haunted underground of Seattle. And again, you could see where the brothels were and the opium dens, and where the reported hauntings had been. I didn't sense anything while I was going on the tour, but I just found it fascinating, and the history of it fascinating.
Yeah, I love on the show here. I love to cover the history. That's why I like getting people like you from the Haunted America series, because the Haunted America series from the History Press is a lot about the history. They want the history as well as the hauntings, and so yeah, I love all of that, because I think, and I've said it many times on the show here for my listeners, but yeah, I talk a lot about how you have to understand the history to know how a place is haunted to begin with.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, and I've met a few people who I would call history purists, who think that it's just the historical facts that matter. It's not what I would call the folklore that grew up out of these historical events. And I think it's these haunted tales are part of the folklore that grow up out of these haunted events. And to me, the folklore is just about as important as the actual historical facts themselves, because these tales, these beliefs permeate the communities in which they occur, and it just gives life to these communities. And I think it's very difficult to separate the pure history from these folkloric haunted tales.
Yeah, and paranormal tourism is at an all-time high. You know, people want to go hear about the history of these historical places, but they also want to hear the hauntings. And so at least you're getting some education with some entertainment too. That's what I like about it.
Right. And just this past October, and I'll say again, this particular area, there's lots of haunted tours in the bigger cities of Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, California, and Seattle, Washington. And despite the fact that, to me, there's this rich folklore/haunted history in this particular area, and Astoria, Oregon, for anyone who's not familiar, is roughly 2.5 hours north of Portland and roughly 3 hours south of Seattle. And it lies on the coast, again, where the Columbia River empties out into the Pacific Ocean. And I know of one haunted tour, but there's not a lot done. Now, this is a little bit less populated area, although it's growing in population. And this past October, I actually conducted what is the first of what I hope are some regular. This was a haunted trolley tour on an old-fashioned looking, although it's a new mechanized trolley throughout the area, and it was very well received. And we're talking about making that more of a regular occurrence.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Especially the trolley, because you don't have to walk around. You just ride around and hear the stories and the history.
Right.
Yeah, we've got here in the Nashville area. We have a few of those. Of course, we had all the walking tours too, but I think with like the trolley rides and that type of stuff, you can hit a lot more places because you don't have to walk 30 minutes to get there. But part of the Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific, as you had said, it's not just the water, but there are also lots of stories about ships and pirates and buried treasure that you have in the book as well. That's pretty interesting. Because normally you don't think Pacific Northwest and think of pirates and buried treasure. That's more like a Caribbean, Florida, South Carolina type thing.
Right. And there are, and I mentioned in the book, one particular buried treasure story actually came from a Spanish galleon, a Spanish ship that wrecked along the northern Oregon coast in 1693. And the stories are, and these are passed down from Native American tales and adventurer accounts. And that, by the way, is much of where I get the information are Native American tales, oral history, adventurer accounts, government reports, newspapers dating back to the mid-1800s and working forward. Anyway, the ship wrecked in 1693 off of what is called the Tillamook area of northern Oregon. And it's probably 30 minutes south of Astoria, Oregon. Anyway, the ship wrecked. The Native Americans saw it wreck. About 30 crew and a captain came on shore onto what is called Miyakani Mountain. There's a large rocky outcropping. If anyone's familiar with the Oregon coast, in some ways, if you've been to Maine, it looks a little bit like the Maine coast. It's very rocky. There are rocky outcroppings. There's small mountains. Anyway, the captain and the crew were seen by the Native Americans carrying a treasure chest up this mountain. And then the captain, knowing that the Native Americans at that time were very fearful of the dead and ghosts, made sure to kill one or two of his own crewmen and buried it with the treasure chest. And then the crew left and reportedly sailed to Mexico. And as he wanted, the Native Americans never disturbed where the buried treasure was buried, but stories have been passed on over the last several hundreds of years, strange noises, strange events, and then, of course, people wanting to search for treasure. Many hundreds of people were digging on Miyakani Mountain in northern Oregon, which actually has the nickname of the Mountain of 1,000 Holes because of all these people looking for the buried treasure. And Oregon, the state of Oregon, actually allowed this to take place, I believe, up until 1999, and then outlawed the digging on public lands. But there's just been countless stories ever since of hauntings and supposedly pirates and actually, if you've heard of the movie The Fog, actually is based on that story, and it details supposed pirate crew and buried treasure and strange fog that comes inland. So that's one of the more colorful stories. And there's just dozens, if not hundreds, of other stories. In addition to the pirates and the buried treasure, and then the Native Americans whose lands were stolen, there are countless tales of lighthouses along the coast and lighthouse keepers. The second windiest area in America is not far from here. It's called Cape Disappointment, which is on the southwestern Washington coast. And there are haunted stories around a lighthouse keeper's wife who basically, for lack of a better term, went crazy in the early 20th century based on being so isolated and the winds, and she committed suicide. Her spirit has been reportedly seen many times. We also have, and as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the history, especially Civil War history and military forts, are primarily on the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic states. But in fact, there are Civil War era forts out here in the Pacific Northwest as well. Fort Stevens, and Fort Canby, and Fort Columbia. And there are many stories around hauntings at these military forts. Fort Vancouver in Vancouver, Washington. There's many stories of what have been described as ghostly soldiers and apparitions, and I could go on. And you also mentioned Lewis and Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition, for folks who know, was under the administration of Thomas Jefferson. President Jefferson had Lewis and Clark come out to explore all the way out to the Pacific Northwest. They came out to this part of the country in what is now called the Graveyard of the Pacific in about 1805, 1806. And there are many tales related to that expedition, including Meriwether Lewis, who, after the expedition was over with, later on became the governor of the Louisiana Territory. And there's lots of history around the fact that he died a mysterious death. I believe it was in Tennessee, which Eric, you mentioned, you're from Tennessee.
Yeah.
I think I'll say it was Grinder's Mill or something to that effect. But there are many statues out here in the Pacific Northwest dedicated to Lewis and Clark, and there have been stories of strange sounds around the statues of Meriwether Lewis. And he was reported to have said, "I'm no coward," and things to that effect. And strange things have been heard by folks when they visit these statues. So just very colorful history.
And that's weird that you say that, because about an hour from me is where he died and where he's buried, and they have a big monument, and people have reported of hearing the same thing around his grave and monument.
In fact, he was shot twice, and not many, if it was a suicide, not many people shoot themselves twice if they're committing suicide. And it was just all very mysterious. And although he died back in Tennessee and he was the governor of the Louisiana Territory, a lot of his exploits were out here in the Pacific Northwest. And you can't go really a mile or two without seeing a statue dedicated to Lewis and Clark. And so there is that rich history, especially related to his death.
Yeah. It's, I always find, another interesting thing, I always find interesting connections between things that I know of around here and things I've experienced with a lot of my guests who have never really lived here. Or, it's just weird coincidences with stuff like that. I just find it interesting. But
yeah, I agree. And I think there's a great similarity. I mentioned earlier that I've visited many different parts of the country, and I've lived in a number of different parts of the country. And many of these haunted tales, it's far more than coincidence, I think, that there's just so many similarities and so many similar things that have been heard and felt. And the Meriwether Lewis story is a prime example of that.
Yeah. One of the things I want to get back to you were talking about the Civil War forts and stuff. One of the things that I read in the book that I don't remember learning this in history class, but there was actually during World War II, there was a Japanese submarine that came up the Columbia River.
Right. And I want to say it was Fort Stevens in southwestern Washington. But in any event, there's actually three forts that guarded the mouth of the Columbia River. And they were primarily built, one or more were built during the Civil War. Others expected attacks from other foreign powers. And so this particular attack by this Japanese submarine is the only reported attack by a foreign power on American soil since the War of 1812, when, of course, the British attacked Washington and parts of Maryland and elsewhere. And again, you can go visit the fort. You can visit all these different forts. They're now basically parkland and other museums and things like that. The reports at the time, and there were many newspaper reports at the time, no one was killed during the attack, but people were described as you can imagine, going crazy with these missiles and other projectiles coming inland. The only damage was damage to, I think, was a softball field and some other areas. But to this day, there have been stories relayed by visitors to these forts, in this one particular fort, sort of ghostly soldiers dating back to the Civil War, wearing Civil War uniforms. This one particular fort was built in, I believe, it was 1863 during the Civil War, and but other ghostly apparitions of soldiers wearing later war uniforms, including World War II. And what I found is that with many of these tales are related to unexpected deaths and shipwrecks and suicides, but some of them are not related to deaths. they were related to traumatic events. And so I would put this attack by the Japanese submarine on the fort as being a traumatic event. And even though no one was killed, it seems like for whatever reason there are these reported hauntings, and people say that it's because of this, in part because of this attack.
Yeah, kind of going back to the stone tape theory, where a lot of paranormal investigators believe that it can be high energy, high traumatic events like that can be recorded on the environment and then kind of played back when the conditions are right.
Right.
You kind of started in I was going to say this earlier, but you kind of started in the South with the book and kind of worked your way up the coast. One of the things that I found interesting was the Columbia River's Ellis Island, where they actually took in immigrants.
Right. And I have a few notes here. I want to make sure I get the correct fort name. It was Fort Stevens that was attacked during World War II in 1942 by this Japanese submarine, and it was built in 1863, as I mentioned. But yes, there's a small town in this region called Nassau, Washington. And another little-known fact, and again, I grew up in the Northeast, and I spent much of my life on the East Coast, and I do find that maybe there's less awareness of some of these historical facts about the West, especially the Pacific Northwest. But as you were saying, there were two of these what we call quarantine stations in the West back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I believe one was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the other one was in this area, and it was called the Knapton Cove Quarantine Station. It operated from 1899 to 1938, and the purpose was, as immigrants were coming to this country, the government was afraid of them carrying contagious diseases and being insane and having other maladies. They had many people who were suspected of having these maladies. They had them basically checked out medically. And so this Knapton Cove Quarantine Station was the one here in the Pacific Northwest. And there are reports of hundreds, if not thousands, of immigrants going to this quarantine station, which is now a museum, and being medically checked and being watched. And it went out of operation in 1938. I think I mentioned it's a museum now. But there have been paranormal investigators who have visited there, like they've gone to many places, and they've done experiments. One in particular, which I mentioned in the book, is they put a cup of coffee on a countertop within this quarantine station, and they placed their electronic devices, and then they left for some period of time. When they came back, part of the coffee was gone. They listened to the recordings, and they heard whispers, disembodied whispers, as they called it, of someone saying coffee, coffee. What other strange things have been seen? People in period clothing from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And again, we think of Ellis Island, of course, was the largest operation basically in the country through which immigrants would pass throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And we don't think so much about the West Coast, but many immigrants did come through the West Coast, and this quarantine station played a key role and has many reported hauntings related to it.
Yeah, and you could just think of, like we were talking about, the places with all the emotion, and just think of something like that. I'm sure there were probably people who were sick trying to come into the country, and people who got turned away, and it's just a high emotion. People excited to come to a new country for a better life, and yeah, it's just one of those things kind of imprinted on the environment. Not saying, like you were talking about with the coffee stuff, not saying that there's not anything there that's not intelligent, but a lot of it, probably is just imprinted from all of the energy.
Yeah. Now this, if you haven't had an opportunity to visit the Pacific Northwest, I highly suggest that you do. As I mentioned in the book, this part of the country is thought of as being more wild because it was more recently settled than places on the East Coast. I would go, I mentioned before we started the interview, I had visited Salem, Massachusetts, and some other places in the Northeast just this past October, and walked around the graveyard, and there are tombstones from the 1600s. And out here, you don't see that so much. You see in graveyards, which there are, it's probably not a surprise, a number of stories of haunted cemeteries and graveyards in this area, many of them related to shipwreck and drowning victims from the graveyard of the Pacific. The tombstones are primarily from the mid-1800s on, but there's no shortage of these haunted tales and ghostly tales. And while I think of it, we always think of the Bermuda Triangle as being a place of great reported paranormal activities. It's fascinating to me that reportedly only 50 ships went down in the Bermuda Triangle, whereas over 2,000 ships have gone down in the graveyard of the Pacific. And so the graveyard of the Pacific is lesser known, and yet the paranormal activity is far greater. And Ghost Adventures, the Travel Channel series, did actually come out to this area and did a 4-part series in 2018 called Graveyard of the Pacific. And they explore some of these things that I'm mentioning now.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating area. And I would be completely remiss, my audience would probably be mad if I didn't ask about Bigfoot, because out that area is a huge, and you got a chapter in the book about La Push and Forks, Washington, and that area was where they also filmed the movie Twilight. People might be familiar.
Right.
But how about Sasquatch and Bigfoot out in that area?
You're right. This is also an area of what I would call fantastical creature sightings. And in the book, I talk about Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and they're just tales that have come down through Native American oral history, dating back hundreds of years. These large, hairy, almost gorilla-looking like people, for lack of a better term, who have been reported. And most of the tales have them as being sort of docile and not very dangerous, although some Native American tales do talk about them being cannibalistic, and there would be warnings to children to stay out of certain areas and not to talk about these Sasquatch or Bigfoot because they could, in fact, attack. But the stories permeate the area, primarily northwestern Oregon, throughout the Washington state, all the way to the Idaho border. And, yeah, there have been just numerous stories, numerous reportings. I'll give just a quick plug to my next book, which is coming out, again, from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. And this one is called Spirits Along the Columbia River. That's scheduled to come out this year in 2022. And it also contains stories of Sasquatch and Bigfoot. And that book is different in that, whereas I focus on the Graveyard of the Pacific, I focus primarily on the coastal areas, both water and inland. Spirits Along the Columbia River follow the Columbia River inland through Oregon and Washington state to the Idaho border. But again, there are haunted tales of Sasquatch. Also, not necessarily in this book, but I'll be happy to talk about it at a later date. There have been sea serpent recordings in the Columbia River and elsewhere throughout this region, dating back to the mid-20th century. And so these fantastical creatures, there's a rich history of thunderbirds and other Native American types of creatures. But you mentioned going up to La Push, and for folks who are not familiar with that area, I start the book, as you mentioned, Eric, along the northwestern Oregon coast. I worked my way up. I intended it to be almost like a road map, a haunted road map of this region. So I go up through northwestern Oregon, through Astoria, Oregon, up the Washington coast, which is actually where I am. And as you continue up the Washington coast, getting closer to the border with Canada, which is Vancouver Island and Victoria, and a little bit inland to Seattle, then you start getting to places like La Push. And if you've seen the movie series Twilight, of course they relate to vampire stories and werewolves. And there's a Native American tribe in that region that believes it is descended from wolves, and they have ceremonies and dances where they wear wolf-like clothing. And so I think that the author of the Twilight series got some of the ideas, and has said that she got some of the ideas based on the fact that this Native American tribe has this tradition, oral history tradition, of believing they're descended from wolves. And then if you visited the Pacific Northwest, parts of it are very much like a rainforest. It can get kind of dark and rainy, of course. And I think that that's how the author decided to base this series on vampires. And I won't go into all the details of it, but of course this particular family of vampires likes being in an area where there's not much sunlight, and as their skin sparkles when there's sun. So it's just interesting stories of vampires and werewolves, and again, Sasquatch. There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of reports of Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and it's fascinating. Other parts of the country have reported reports of other types of what I would call fantastical creatures, but this particular region is particularly rich in it. And then you'd mentioned the severed feet. I don't know if you want to talk about that now.
Yeah. I find it interesting because I don't think they ever figured out where they were coming from.
Right. There have been dozens of severed feet found along the northwestern Washington coast into Canada, and the authorities have never been able to pinpoint why this is happening. They seem to be individual feet, many times in sneakers, and they wash ashore. There's been some theories put out there by state government authorities that maybe they are suicide victims. Some people said they're shipwreck victims, but others say that they're suicide victims who jump off of some of the bridges, and we have some very high bridges out here in the west. The Bay Area, just not too far from where I am, is the Megler Bridge, which is if you Google it, you'll see it's a very large bridge that goes between Oregon and Washington State. And I believe there have been dozens of suicides on that bridge. Anyway, the authorities think it's because of the ebb and the flow of the ocean waves. And the Pacific Ocean is pretty dramatically active in this part of the country. Again, I grew up closer to the Atlantic Ocean, which has its own set of waves and activity, but you've never seen anything quite like the Pacific Ocean until you come out to this part of the country with the giant waves and just the back and forth, and especially where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean. And they think that limbs, which are for lack of a better way to put it, are the first parts of these bodies in the water that actually become severed from the rest of the body, and that's why they think these feet are washing ashore. And I think I mentioned in the book, it literally is, in some ways, the graveyard of the Pacific because of these dead bodies and body parts which have washed ashore and been found.
Yeah, I don't know if I buy that explanation just because where's the rest of the body when it's just the individual feet washing up, and
Right.
And if it was that violent, to just tear off a foot, then why are a lot of them still in their shoes? And that it's just one of those weird things that we may never know where it came from. But yeah, I've heard about that on true crime. I'm a huge true crime nerd too, and I've heard about that on different theories from some of the true crime people. But yeah, it's just weird, just feet washing up. It's just creepy and odd, and just something that only happens there,
Right. Yeah, I'd never heard of stories like this on the East Coast, and obviously the ocean surrounds this country, at least on two sides. But yeah, I've never heard stories like this, and these are not just stories; these are actual events which have taken place. I'd be remiss. I talked earlier about Shanghai's, and there's actually a town not too far from here. Again, folks probably are not familiar with it unless you're familiar with this part of the country. The town is called Aberdeen, Washington, and it's thought, and I do talk about this in the book, that he's reported to be, I say he, his name was Billy Gohl. He was actually born in Germany. He lived in this area in the early 20th century, 1905, 1910. He's reported to be the worst mass murderer in American history, although few people know his name. He was convicted of murdering 2 people, but it's thought that he murdered well over 100. And in this little town, Aberdeen, Washington, which lies on a river, he worked for the Sailors Union, basically recruiting new sailors to come in. But what he would really do was he would question these sailors if they came in looking for work, find out if they had family or other people who would miss them, and if they didn't have anybody who would miss them, inevitably he would make off with their money. He'd steal their money, and he would shoot them. And reportedly, he would drop them through a chute in the bottom and the floor of his office, and they would go out to the rivers surrounding this Aberdeen, Washington. And to this day, the river has the informal nickname of the River of Floaters, because of these bodies that would be found floating in this river because of Billy Gohl and the fact that he was murdering people. So it's things like that that is sort of unique to this part of the country, and it just gives it a certain tone. I describe in the book how the weather is dramatic here. It tends to have, people think of the Pacific Northwest as rainy, and it does tend to be rainy here in the winter months. It's very nice weather during the spring into the fall, but oftentimes there's heavy cloud cover. There's lots of, as we know, tall trees, and it just has a certain feel to it that other parts of the country doesn't have. And it makes for a great setting for haunted tales and ghost stories, which is why I think movies like The Goonies and the Twilight series and many of the shots that were used for the movie The Shining were filmed not too far from here in Government Camp, Oregon. And actually, Astoria, Oregon has the informal nickname of being the Hollywood of the Pacific Northwest, because many movies, if you're familiar with the Free Willy, Killer Whale series, and other movies have been made here.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating area, and there's so much in the book, so many different stories and fascinating things. One of the last stories that I wanted to ask you about is the mortuary massacre.
Right.
I found that interesting story, and it kind of, like I said, I'm a true crime nerd, so I like when the paranormal and true crime kind of cross.
Right, and again, I should take a step back and say I take everything with a grain of salt. Again, my background has been as a senior government executive. I'm an attorney. I'm a professor. I pride myself on being a historian and a researcher, and so I believe something when I have enough proof that it actually happened. The mortuary story, I say all that because there are present-day mortuary, this particular mortuary, there are haunted tours. Around Halloween, they have certain events, and so I take that all into account. But as you mentioned, in 1968, there was a reported mass murder inside this mortuary in Seattle, where 9 employees are said to have been killed. And there have been reported hauntings and unexplainable sounds and noises and footsteps and just a feeling of foreboding and dread. And I have done lots of work trying to find more formal government-related, police-related reports, and I have not been able to find much. Although it does, if you Google Seattle mortuary mass murder 1968, you will find what I think is some significant information that this did occur. I take it with a grain of salt because I have not been able to find police reports and things like that. But it's been covered in Seattle-based newspapers, and the stories I think are relatively well known in the Seattle area. So again, that's just one of those fascinating things, one of those fascinating stories that occurs around here.
Yeah, I find it. And one of the things you're saying, because I always call myself a skeptical believer, because I'm very much of that opinion. And being a paranormal investigator and researcher for over 25 years, I always go into a place. You don't go into a place to investigate a haunting. We go into a place to investigate the stories of a haunting.
Right.
Because until you have an experience, you don't know if it's haunted or not. And until you have any kind of evidence, you can't say, so I always, that's kind of my motto is, we're going in to investigate the stories of a haunting.
Right. And I always preface things by saying reported hauntings and reported events and eyewitnesses stated. And so like you, unless I experience something myself, I'm going to base it on the amount of level of evidence and documentation related to particular incidents. I would also say that I'm a skeptical believer. I say in the book I wouldn't describe myself as a full believer. However, there's such an overlap, really worldwide, with so many of these types of haunted stories and tales. And for as long as there's been recorded history, there have been reported hauntings and ghost stories. And I think that, to me, there's just too much evidence to discount any of this. And I would like to believe that many of these things are true. But again, I approach it skeptically and try to rely on evidence wherever I can.
And at the very least, it's like we were kind of talking about, you learn something from the history with the ghost stories. And so even if the stories aren't true, at least you're learning something and you're entertained at the same time.
Right. And I've been asked the question, well, why are there these stories? And of course, you and I could talk probably at great length about, anywhere from they're just fun stories to tell around the campfire, and many people like to be scared. That's why we watch horror movies and things like that. But I think that there's really no separating the history of any particular area from the folklore and the tales, and including these haunted tales and ghost stories. And I think that you learn a lot about a region, and that's one of the main reasons why I got into writing these types of books, is as a relatively new transplant to this area, I've been here for about 2.5 years, I wanted to delve into the history, and I started looking at this folklore and haunted tales, and it makes me feel like I'm part of this community in the region. And I also found that coming from the East Coast primarily, many of these tales are not known as well as others on the East Coast and elsewhere. But I think the history is, I would say, just as rich, and maybe even more so when you start talking about the graveyard of the Pacific. So I think there are many other stories out there to be told.
Yeah. That's one reason I want to have you on is because, like we were talking about at the very beginning, you really don't have all these paranormal shows coming out that way. You've got a few that have done stuff, but for the most part, it's a part of the country that, especially where I live and kind of on the East Coast, that's where you get most of the shows filming and most of the haunted stories. And, other than Bigfoot, out in the Pacific Northwest, that's mainly what I hear. You don't hear a lot of the ghost stories and stuff. So that's one of the reasons I want to have you on.
Right. No, I appreciate that.
All right. Well, everybody needs to go out and check out the book. There's plenty more stories, and we just touched on a few here, and plenty more stories, a lot more history, a lot more in depth with the hauntings and that type of stuff. So go out and check out Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific by Ira Wesley Kitmacher, and you can find it on Amazon Kindle or at ArcadiaPublishing.com. Also, Arcadia Publishing is awesome with the History Press and their Haunted America series. There are lots of great books. I'm very fortunate that they are willing to send me review copies and give me the info to get a hold of authors like you so I can have you on the show and get these books out there, because I think they're great where they come from, like I was saying, from the history standpoint, and you also have the hauntings in there.
Right. And I appreciate your inviting me to be on your show. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I'll give one last quick plug to the book, which is I've been told by Arcadia Publishing and the History Press that it has been one of the more successful titles. It ran out. It exhausted its first printing of about 400 copies. I think they're on now the third or fourth printing. And just within the last few weeks, Arcadia Publishing reached out to me. They have a new series, which are more focused to middle-aged school children. So they're converting some of their titles to that audience. And they asked me if they could use this book as one of the, I think there's probably 22 or so titles that are being converted for that purpose. So watch out for this book in that new format.
Yeah, that's awesome. When I was in middle school, I was always the weird kid at like the book fair that was looking for books like this, and there wasn't a whole lot, out then. 25 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of this stuff out there, and so yeah, I think it's great that they're starting to get it in the book fairs, because there's more and more people interested, especially kids. Kind of now, like middle school kids have kind of grown up in this environment where it's huge in pop culture with the hauntings and Bigfoot and all that stuff, and so yeah, that's awesome.
I agree.
So, do you know when your next book is coming out? I know you said it's coming out soon.
It's due to Arcadia Publishing next month in February, and I know that they generally like to publish these titles in the Haunted America series towards the fall. So I'm expecting anywhere from summer through early fall that it will be coming out. And again, the title is Spirits Along the Columbia River. Many more of these haunted tales, ghost tales, as well as these fantastical creatures, which there are many stories about in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm looking forward to that coming out as well. Awesome.
Yeah, I'll be on the lookout for it and definitely check it out and have you back on. We'll talk about that.
That sounds great. I appreciate it.
All right, Ira, thank you so much for coming on today. Really enjoyed our conversation. Everybody, have a great day. Stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
To the end of